Hi, I'm David Riley, and thank you for joining me today for another edition of People in Politics. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to the show. I'd be very grateful indeed. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because joining me on today's show is a parliamentarian who's been around for a very long time and served senior roles in both the government and the shadow government. I'm really looking forward to talking to him about his role as Defence Minister and more recently his championing and commitment to people with Down syndrome. So, please welcome to the show Sir Liam Fox. Welcome to People in Politics. Sir Liam, thank you so much for coming on the show. So nice to meet you. I'm very grateful for you.
Likewise.
Yeah. And you've done it on quite a day because today's the day that Hamza Yusuf resigned here in Scotland, so that'll kick off a whole lot of the shenanigans up here in Scotland, I've no doubt. But if it's okay with you today, I wanted to talk to you about defence because you served as Shadow Defence Secretary, I think, under John Major, was it, from 2005 to 2010, and then when David Cameron became Prime Minister, you were, of course, made Defence Secretary. And of course, defence has been on the news so much recently, and so I thought I'd talk for that. But looking back over your career in Parliament, I couldn't begin to recite all the positions you've held in both the government and opposition. It's quite a string of positions.
What happens when you've been around forever? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I'm guessing being in government must be better than opposition.
Well, it's an interesting point you make because I hear people saying, well, maybe a period in opposition will, would do the Conservative Party good. You can't choose a period. Once you no longer have the levers of power, you're at the mercy of somebody else. And I was on the front bench for every day of the miserable, barren, and bitter 13 years we had in opposition. And when people say that's a good thing, well, frankly, they have no idea how absolutely soul destroying a long period in opposition can be. So, as I often say to them, your worst day in government is better than your best day in opposition, and you better remember it.
That's kind of good one. That's kind of, I guess there's a lot less you can do. In fact, you can do decidedly less from opposition than you can in government. So I wanted to ask you, when you became Defence Minister in 2010, what was going on at that time? What was the reason? Because I'm guessing that we were going into a period of austerity, and I suppose your brief would be to cut back.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, so we had a number of things going on. First of all, of course, if you remember when we came to power in 2010, the former chief secretary left a bit of paper, said there's no money left, which was absolutely right. The government's deficit was 11% of our GDP, which was the highest it had ever been in peacetime. And it took us several years to get that back down under 2% again. And what it meant was that across government, there had to be a big drive to get the public finances back into balance, and defence couldn't be immune from that. The second thing was that we inherited an absolute mess in defence. We estimated that the the overspend, as it were, the overdraft on the MOD account in the next 10 years would be about 39 billion pounds. In other words, they had agreed to programs that where there was no money to fund them. And put it into context, it was overdrawn at least 39 billion pounds, and the annual budget was only 36. When we finished the defence review, we thought the actual deficit we'd been left with was about 55 billion. So it was absolutely unbelievable. And this was at a time, if you remember, that we still had a big military presence in Afghanistan, and we're just coming out of Iraq at the time. So it was a really difficult time in defence, and we had to conduct a defence review that basically gave us a 10-year plan as to how we would recover from the position in which we started.
And I'm guessing the strategic defence review, I guess it told you that we'd be savings, and if we cut back on several thousand troops on the aircraft and carriers, is that correct?
Well, I was very keen that we saw an upgrade in the Navy. Britain is a maritime nation. We're an island. We depend 94% on the sea lanes for our trade, including the food that we have in our country. And so maritime security had to be number one. So leaving aside the strategic nuclear deterrent that we have, and leaving and then looking at our other programs, I was very keen that we would have both of our aircraft carriers. And at the time, the first one hadn't been completed, and there was a big argument about whether it should be completed and whether we should have a second one. I argued very strongly that we should, and of course now we do have the two. But that meant that we had to make sure that we were as lean as possible elsewhere. Simple things like saying to the RAF, you can have only two types of fast jets. So if you want to introduce Typhoon, you can't have both Harrier and Tornado. One of them's got to go. So Harrier got phased out to have Typhoon and Tornado. Then if you want to have F-35s that we have today, Tornado's got to go, so that you've got Typhoon and F-35, because the expense of keeping three types of fast jets is pretty prohibitive. And so you've got to take difficult decisions. And I always say that the reason we get paid as politicians is to take the decisions that no one else would really like to have to take. So, and we had a number of principles in that defence review, that the top one being that we had to take any reductions in spending in things that could be quickly reconstituted, but we couldn't take cuts in things that would take a long time to reconstitute, for example, our nuclear technology and submarines and so on. So we had to take gaps that were, the best guess we could make in conjunction with the military and our other strategic advisors. And fortunately, we got through that period that took us to 2015, and then we had another partial review that took us beyond that. And the process that we set up was to have a rolling 5-year review with always a 10-year horizon. So that has stuck. I'm afraid that the budget's got a bit overdrawn again. And I think that the Ministry of Defence needs some much better cost control mechanisms brought back into it.
What percentage of GDP was the defence budget at that time? And were there many thousands of troops cut back or laid off, particularly after Afghanistan? Because so
the biggest reductions we actually had were in the civil service. We took about 37% cut in the size of the civil service relating to the MOD. And it's always a shame to let people go, but we had to find ways of making those reductions that didn't actually reduce the defence capacity of the country. And then the army, of course, did come down in numbers, but then you have to think about what are the most likely threats to the UK, and what are the elements of different threats that we face together with our NATO allies. So the spending's always been above 2%, but it's now increasing, as you know, to 2.5%
Yeah,
of GDP. But then, anyone can spend more money. Whether you spend it wisely is a different question, and whether you spend it on the most appropriate elements. And, frankly, we're not facing, Napoleon's forces or the Russian hordes coming across East Anglian plains. We're much more likely to be threatened by attacks on our infrastructure through cyber from China or from Russia. We are susceptible to other regional threats, as we've seen in maritime ways from the Iranians at the present time. So we need to constantly look at what those threats are and be flexible to that. And the bottom line, I think, in all of this is that as we go forward, and even if we're spending more money, it won't always be on capabilities that we can see in the way
yeah.
that it's been in the past. And in cyber, we live in what I call the war of the invisible enemy. And a lot of our weaponry will also have to be invisible
Yeah.
in dealing with that. And, we might not believe that we're under threat, but, our institutions of government, of defense, even things like the NHS are under constant attack from potential cyber criminals as well as nation states and cyber terrorists.
Yeah, I guess it must be quite hard sell to the electorate because, it's what it is to sell them to sell them more hospital beds or better schools or better public transport. But it must be harder to sell them, tighter cyber security or.
Well, you can spend money on all these other things, but if you don't have sufficient cyber security,
Yeah.
and the NHS can be attacked from outside, or the banking system on which everyone depends can be attacked from outside, people would soon discover how vulnerable they themselves could be in that environment. And the job of the government is to take the decisions that the government believes is in the right interest of the people of the country, not necessarily what the opinion polls say at any one time. And we're not there to be popular. In fact, when I worked for Margaret Thatcher, she used to say, if you want to be popular, she would say, you go into light entertainment. Politics is the wrong career if you want to be popular.
That's
And it's a bit like when I was working as a doctor, you had to tell people what was actually wrong with them, not what they wanted to hear. And sometimes that meant breaking news that people didn't really want to have to listen to, but ethically it was your job to tell them the truth and therefore embark on the solutions that you needed to do. So I see a lot of those same echoes in government. And if we just want to reflect what the public think at any one time, why not just govern by YouGov?
yeah, of course. It must be, it must be difficult. Well, within the economic cycle from all the defense cuts at the beginning of the 2010, and so what do you think of that whole sort of rhetoric right now about us being in a pre-war uh, environment? Do you think that's helpful or not helpful?
Well, it depends really what you mean, doesn't it? Because um, we've seen a democratic sovereign European country invaded by Russia. There is a war in Europe for the first time since World War II, and we've seen Iran's attack on Israel, one nation state against another. So we already exist in a period of global history where there are wars affecting ourselves and our allies. And we live in a very interconnected and interdependent world, and we have to recognize that none of us will be immune from the effects of conflicts elsewhere. Therefore, we've got much more responsibility to try to maintain the global order. That's why when people like Putin undertake a murderous and unprovoked campaign against countries like Ukraine, it's our duty to go out and support them by giving them the weapons they need to defend themselves. Because if Ukraine were to be defeated, it would mean that the principle of might is right had taken hold, and that it was totally about the will of the strongest being imposed on everybody else, and that doesn't leave you with any reasonable framework of international law, and there's no global rules-based system to fall back on. So yeah, we do have to be involved in that. I think when we get talk about having to have conscription in the UK, for example, that's just going way too far, and the risk there is of panicking and frightening the public unnecessarily. But we do need to be frank and treat the public as grown-ups, and tell them the sort of threats that we face on a day-to-day basis, but also some of the international threats that are out there, and how we best deal with them. Far better that we are using our money in the UK to help the Ukrainians defend themselves than be drawn into a wider conflict where our own armed forces, for example, would need to be utilized were a NATO country to be attacked.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess who could have foreseen, not so many years ago, that there'd be a war in Europe?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I would say all the warning signs were there. And I remember back in the 2005, 2006, being criticized in the House of Commons and elsewhere for being a warmonger, for saying how dangerous Putin was. And all the warning signs were there. He invaded Georgia in 2008. He occupied Crimea in 2014. So in my view, it wasn't really a surprise that he attacked Ukraine, because his aim has always been to recreate the Soviet Empire by force. And we should have taken much stronger measures way back in 2008 than we did. But that came at a time, I think, of particular weakness in the West. I think you had the Brown government in Britain, and you had the Obama administration in the United States. It didn't do enough to support the sort of incipient uprising in Iran, when people tried to overturn the regime of the mullahs then, and they didn't respond strongly enough to the Russians over Georgia. And I think that undermined the most important element of defense of all, which is deterrence.
Yeah.
And if people think that they can do things without us reacting, they're likely to do more things.
Yeah, cool.
And in many ways, I think that the scale of the crisis we face in Ukraine today is made worse by the fact we didn't do anything before, given Russia's hostile acts, and I think also the way that the West pulled out of Afghanistan in a way that was wrong on so many different levels.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I don't fully understand the context, but I've heard of commentators saying that if we were going to deal with President Putin, with his strong argument that we should have done it in 2014, and was that when he was in Georgia?
Yeah, 2008 we should have done it, in my view, and we allowed Putin to believe that the West wouldn't react in the way that we have done following his unprovoked and murderous incursion into Ukraine. I mean, deterrence is a very precious thing, and once you lose a credible deterrent, then the price that you will have to pay against aggressors goes up.
Yeah, of course. Well, I don't know if I just involving Ukraine, but a month ago or so, a few weeks ago, UK jets were involved in defending Israel from Iran's attack, and I was kind of surprised at that, because yeah, I was surprised at that, because they were actively defending Israel when we're not coming to the defense of Palestinian people.
Well, you have to understand the nature of the threat here. The Iranian regime, it wasn't just a hostile act towards Israel. The Iranian regime under Ayatollah Khamenei doesn't believe that Israel should exist as a state. So it's an existential threat that Israel is facing. The Iranians have said a number of times that they don't think Israel should be allowed to be a state at all. Now, we've been talking about a two-state solution, and it's something I very strongly believe in, that there should be a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. But the Iranians don't believe in a two-state solution because they don't believe that Israel should be one of the states. And therefore, there's a threat to the state of Israel itself. It is, of course, linked to, but it's also at the same time different from what is happening in Gaza, where you've got a counter operation against the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel. Something that we all would like to see over as quickly as possible.
Yeah, of course. And I'm just gonna ask you if you had any idea how that might play out, if there's any sort of end game to the Gaza.
I think we have to think very differently about the Middle East. So I chair the UK's Abraham Accords group, and the Abraham Accords were set up to normalize relations between Arab states and Israel, to try to bring mutual prosperity, mutual understanding into the equation, so that the whole of the Middle East wouldn't just be about Israel and Palestine. And that was, of course, moving forward. In fact, when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said that they were increasingly moving towards normalizing relations with Israel, I thought that Iran would react negatively to that, either through Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis, it turns out, through all three. But it doesn't mean that the process itself doesn't need to continue. And I'm working at the present time to try to set up, and I hope we'll be able to announce in the relatively near future, a fund to help young people in the region, whether they're Arabs or Palestinians, Israelis, Christians or Muslims, Jews, whatever, and to see them as equally as young people who need to have hope and opportunity. And we want to try to bring an economic opportunity to them that many of them don't get today. And I would say, when I look around at other conflicts in the world, that people who've got nothing to lose are likely, to gamble with it. But people who've got something to lose are more circumspect. And I think that we need to try to change the basic paradigm of how politics and international relations and security operate in the Middle East. And that's what many of us are trying to do. So all I can say is watch this space.
Yeah, well, it's obviously a phenomenally complicated situation. Everybody hopes that it ends in peace.
Well, I'm not sure that everybody does, because I think that Iran doesn't. I think Iran does not want there to be peace in the region, because Iran does not want there to be a reconciliation between Arab states and Israel for the very reason that I gave you. So what we have to do is to work with the people of who are willing to see reconciliation, who want to see cooperation, and in many cases want to work for a common security goal of protecting themselves against Iran, which is a very thuggish state with a very dangerous theocracy on top of it. I mean, as someone said, it's bad enough dealing with the Soviet Union when you had the concept of mutually assured destruction. But if you've got some people whose religious fanaticism makes them think, that the end of the world is not necessarily a bad thing, you're in a very different sort of position.
Or more dangerous. Yeah, more dangerous. So, yeah. So I wanted to move on to something else. And that's why I've got you here, because one of the reasons I was keen to talk to you is I I know that you're very supportive and collaborative of the Down syndrome community. And on World Down Syndrome Day, you made a great speech in Parliament to try and change the length of gestation time for abortion. And I thought that you certainly gave a really weak response to that, and I wonder if you have made a progress in that, and where did your interest come?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, as you know, as I said a lot of times, when I was growing up, the boy next door to me had Down syndrome.
Wow.
At that time, his life expectancy was only 13 years. By the time I became a junior doctor, that had risen to 32 years. Nowadays, it's about 57 and going up.
Yeah.
So people with Down syndrome can have a much more fulfilled and fulfilling life than before. And that's why I brought in the Down Syndrome Act as a private member's bill. But there are still anomalies in the law. For example, you can have an abortion in Britain up to 40 weeks purely on the diagnosis of Down syndrome. Now, that doesn't fit, in my view, with our equality legislation and our disability legislation. And so I want to have the age equalized at 24 weeks and say, the idea that purely on the basis that a child will have Down syndrome, given all the advances in medicine and the increase in life expectancy and so on, that it's unacceptable to have that as a sole ground for termination of pregnancy. And we've got an interesting coalition. So I've got everyone from Theresa May to George Galloway.
Yeah.
In my coalition for that one. We'll see how many votes we get, but I think that that the most common reaction, David, has been people saying it can't be right. That can't be right. It can't be true.
Yeah,
and when I said, well, actually, it is true. This is what the law says at the moment, and we need to change it. So it depends when we get the criminal justice bill back to the House of Commons, and if the Speaker selects the amendment. But I'm hoping that we'll have lots and lots of names on it, meaning that lots of MPs are giving their support in advance, and that we can make another change, which says to people with Down syndrome, you are a welcome and accepted part of our society, with all the gifts that you can bring as individuals.
Yeah, of course. No, but when I was a kid, I feel like I knew a lot more people, and just saw a lot more people with Down syndrome going around, and some friends of my parents had a son with Down syndrome. He used to come and wake us up every Saturday morning and live with the doorbell. And it would be 9:30 on the dot, and that'd be Keith. But I feel like you see it less. Minutes, because I'm not looking back. I feel there's less people with Down syndrome around.
Well, you've got the other side of that, which is people, because they've got a much longer life expectancy. This is the first generation of people with Down syndrome who are going to outlive their parents. They're going to live long enough to be there when their parents are not. And one of my concerns has always been, how do you alleviate the worry that parents will have, which is what will happen when I'm not there?
Yeah.
And that's why I brought in the Down Syndrome Act, because part of that is to give responsibilities to local authorities to make sure that there is ongoing accommodation and appropriate and quality accommodation, so that parents don't have this fear about what happens when they're not there. It's a through life responsibility that we have.
It's just a fear, I think a lot of people feel that. But when you read that out in the comments, I was shocked because I didn't know that and I imagine what you said was correct. People probably don't realize that there is this tiny difference, I should rightly say, what does it say about
Yeah.
not just people with Down syndrome,
MPs
but
afterwards.
anybody
Yeah.
with disability.
What you wouldn't have been able to see from watching that question time on the TV was the reaction of other MPs who were looking at one another, and people were saying afterwards, I thought you said that you could have a termination up to 40 weeks. I said, yes, that's exactly what I said.
That's amazing.
And it shows that you can be in Parliament a long time, and people are not always aware of some of the laws that we have that people sometimes just forget to update in the light of circumstances. So we'll see. So
You
you can drum me up support for my amendment.
of course, I will. I would, but is it the same for other genetic? I was going to say genetic abnormalities because that's what Down syndrome.
Well, the law is different. The law was intended that if people had very severe and non-compatible
Yeah.
with life problems, then they could be dealt with. What my amendment says is it's not acceptable to have a termination of pregnancy on the diagnosis of Down syndrome alone. And that I think is in line with the spirit of our disability and equality laws, which says you cannot single out one disability for different treatment.
But one thing that I wanted to remind you of is back in 2011 or 2010, when the austerity cuts were being ended, things like services for disability and services for people with Down syndrome, they were the first places to be cut. They were the first places to be done away with. For example, we had somewhere in Edinburgh here called the Engine Shed. It was here for 20 or 30, a long time. It was a really great place. People with Down syndrome and in the land difficulty would go there and be given a job and get a role in the community. But as soon as the austerity cuts came in, services like that were the first to go.
Well, all I'd say to you on that point is people say austerity. What we meant was we were bringing the public finances back to a sustainable level.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to see the sort of measures we had to take. We discussed the measures I had to take in defense, but we were left with a position where we had no money. As the outgoing chief secretary said, that there was no money. And, the government doesn't have any money of its own. It only has taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
And if the public finances are allowed to go to rack and ruin, as they were before we got to office in 2010, then there's inevitably a price to pay. And when you think about it, had we not taken those measures, we wouldn't have had the ability to spend 405 billion when the pandemic came, or to spend over 70 billion on heating support when the Ukraine crisis hit us. And we were lucky that as a country, we were able to afford to deal with those. But think what we would have been able to do had we been able to invest that money in infrastructure and public services and reductions in taxation, had we not had those costs of the pandemic and Ukraine. People very quickly forget the cost of things like the furlough and maintaining jobs in that. So as it's worth pointing out, as Mr. Thatcher used to say, there is no such thing as government money. There is only taxpayers' money. We should remind people, including politicians, of that every day.
Yeah, that's fair. And no, I do see that, but it is a concern to the people such as those that I described who went to that place of work. They expect they would have got jobs elsewhere. They wouldn't have been able to go and get a job. So I will wager that they'll be sitting at home or maybe going to this and that comes into choice.
Well, that's, with the Down Syndrome Act, one of the sort of revolutionary things about that was it gives statutory responsibilities to the health authorities, to education authorities, and local authorities to implement the respective rules for people with Down syndrome. We've never had a piece of legislation that said somebody in the civil service is responsible for the provision of service for these people. And I hope it's a principle that we can roll out, because the way in which we treat people like those with Down syndrome who would otherwise be more vulnerable is, I think, a measure of how civilized a society we actually are.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as a matter, I was disappointed in Richie, because I think his last reshuffle, which could be his last, he merged the role of disability minister with the equality minister, which was okay with person and white is separate. But
well, I think that it's not just the role, it's the quality of the people who are in those roles and how committed they are to ensuring that they stand up for those who might not be able to stand up so well for themselves. And we're lucky that we've had in this country a number of extremely good ministers on that front. So long may that continue, whichever party is in power.
Yeah, let's hope so. We good. So I've still enjoyed talking to you this afternoon, and I'm very grateful for your time, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, David. Thank you very much for having me. And it's quite nice to be in a political conversation where you're not interrupted by a professional commentator before you get to answer the question. So maybe there's another career for you out there.
Well, who knows? But I have to confess that I do watch back and then think, oh, I wish I'd said that, or I wish I'd interrupted there. But it's nice to give people space to talk, and I'm thoroughly enjoying doing this podcast, and just I suppose it's maybe get more disabled people in politics, which incidentally, before you go, I meant to say to you, I don't know if you noticed that there is now a parliamentarian in Spain who has Down syndrome.
I knew, yes.
Which is fantastic. It's really amazing. And I think we get more disability representation in our
we should judge people, shouldn't we, on their merits, not on their labels.
Of course. But yeah, I hope so.
No. Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure.
It's a better. Thank you. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.